For a long time, a very long time, we told ourselves a certain story about who we are. The story went something like this. Humans evolved, slowly climbed out of the darkness of prehistory, learned to farm, built the first cities, invented writing, and from there civilization began. A straight line, a single thread, one species, alone, moving forward. It is a clean story. It is a satisfying story. It is also deeply, measurably incomplete. Here is something that does not get nearly enough attention. Our species, Homo sapiens, us, the people watching this right now, has been walking this earth for roughly 300,000 years. That date comes from the Jebel Irhoud site in Morocco, where in 2017, a team led by paleoanthropologist Jean-Jacques Hublin published findings in the journal Nature, confirming our lineage stretches back at least that far. 300,000 years of human presence on this planet. Now consider this. The oldest writing systems we know of, the Sumerian cuneiform tablets from ancient Mesopotamia, date back around 5,000 years. Egyptian hieroglyphics, roughly the same. The pyramids at Giza, the monuments we hold up as the crowning achievement of ancient humanity, were built approximately 4,500 years ago. So we have been here for 300,000 years. And for the first 295,000 of those years, we left almost nothing in the record that textbooks are willing to call civilization. 295,000 years of silence, or so it seems. The question this film is built around is a quiet one, but it carries real weight. What if that silence is not evidence that nothing was happening, but evidence that we have not yet learned how to listen? There is a hill in southeastern Turkey, in a province called Şanlıurfa, that offers one answer to that question. The site is called Göbekli Tepe. When archaeologist Klaus Schmidt first began serious excavation there in 1994 under the German Archaeological Institute, what he found did not fit the accepted story at all. Massive carved stone pillars, some of them 5.5 meters tall, weighing between 10 and 20 tons, arranged in deliberate circles, covered in intricate animal carvings built by people who, according to everything we thought we knew, should not have been capable of it. The site has been dated to approximately 9,600 years before the Common Era. That makes it more than 11,000 years old, 6,000 years older than Stonehenge, 7,000 years older than the Great Pyramid. The people who built it were, by the standard classification of that era, hunter-gatherers. They were not supposed to have organized religion, centralized labor, or monumental architecture. And yet there it is, still standing, still ancient, still unanswered. Göbekli Tepe alone would be enough to make you pause. But that is only the beginning of what this documentary is going to walk through, because here is the part that tends to stay with people long after they first encounter it. When Homo sapiens was walking across Africa 300,000 years ago, we were not alone. There were others, not animals, not distant ancestors, other human species. People who made tools, buried their dead, cared for the sick, created art, and in some cases had children with us. Their descendants are, in a measurable genetic sense, still here, still carried forward in the bodies of people alive today. The Neanderthals, the Denisovans, a species we did not even know existed until 2010, identified from a single finger bone found in a cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia. Homo floresiensis, a small-statured human species discovered in a cave on the Indonesian island of Flores in 2004. Homo luzonensis, found in Calao Cave in the Philippines and announced to the world as recently as 2019. And Homo naledi, discovered in the Rising Star Cave system in South Africa in 2015, a species that appears to have practiced deliberate burial of the dead more than 335,000 years ago, long before we assumed any human species was capable of that kind of ritual thinking. These were not myths. These were not metaphors. These were real beings with real histories, living on the same planet, breathing the same air, and in several documented cases, sharing children with us. And most people have never heard most of their names. Before we go any further into this story, and there is a great deal more of it to tell if you are finding yourself drawn into this history, into these buried layers of who we really are and where we actually came from. This channel is dedicated entirely to exactly that, to the ancient, the forgotten, and the genuinely unanswered. If you want to follow along as we keep going deeper, Subscribing and turning on notifications means you will be there when the next piece of this story comes out. It takes only a moment, and it genuinely helps this work reach the people who want to find it. Now, back to the silence. 295,000 years is not a gap in human activity, archaeologists have noted, with increasing consistency over the past 2 decades, that it is more accurately described as a gap in our attention. The tools to see into that silence: ancient DNA sequencing, underwater sonar surveys, LiDAR imaging, isotope analysis of sediment cores. Most of them are younger than 30 years old. In geological terms, we only just invented the flashlight, and we have only just begun pointing it at the dark. What is already visible, even in this early stage of looking, is enough to quietly reshape everything you thought you knew about the human story. The species we displaced, the civilizations we have not yet found, the catastrophic events that reset human history and left almost no one alive to record what was lost, the genetic signatures of people whose names we will never know, written into our own bodies like faded letters on ancient stone. This is not a story about the fringes of history. Every site, every fossil, every genome referenced in this film comes from peer-reviewed research, active excavation, and the work of researchers whose names and institutions are on the record. The mystery here does not require invention. The actual record, examined carefully and honestly, is strange enough. We were not the first, we may not have been the most complex, and the world that existed before the world we know, the one that was slowly buried beneath ice, beneath ocean, beneath centuries of accumulated assumption, is beginning, quietly, to surface. There is a number that tends to stop people when they first encounter it: 140,000 years. That is roughly how long Neanderthals and Homo sapiens overlapped on this planet, not separated by ocean, not divided by impassable mountain ranges, but living in adjacent territories, moving through the same river valleys, hunting the same animals, sheltering, in some cases, in the same caves, just at different points in time, and sometimes, the evidence now suggests, at exactly the same point in time. For most of the 20th century, the Neanderthal was the stand-in for everything brutish and primitive about prehistoric humanity. Heavy brow ridges, stooped posture, a kind of glorified animal that our smarter, sleeker ancestors simply outcompeted and replaced. That image was not just an oversimplification. In the light of what science has uncovered over the past 2 decades, it was wrong in almost every meaningful way. Neanderthals buried their dead. At Shanidar Cave, in the Zagros Mountains of northern Iraq, excavated by Ralph Solecki of Columbia University, beginning in 1951, the remains of at least 10 Neanderthal individuals were found in careful burial positions. One burial, known as Shanidar 4, was surrounded by dense concentrations of pollen from at least 8 different flowering plant species evidence. Some researchers argue of deliberate flower placement. The interpretation has been debated, with later researchers suggesting the pollen may have been introduced by burrowing rodents. But what remains undisputed is the deliberate, structured nature of the burials themselves. Neanderthals created personal ornamentation. At Krapina in Croatia, a site that has been studied since the late 1800s, researchers Dvorka Radovcic and colleagues published a study in 2015 in the journal PLOS ONE, documenting eagle talon jewelry specifically. 8 talons from white-tailed eagles, polished, notched, and apparently worn as a necklace or bracelet, approximately 130,000 years ago. This predates the arrival of Homo sapiens in Europe by at least 80,000 years. The talons had no nutritional value, no practical survival function. They were beautiful objects, worn on a body, by a being who understood what it meant to adorn yourself. And then there is the DNA. In 2010, Svante Pääbo and his team at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig published the first draft sequence of the Neanderthal genome in the journal Science. What it revealed changed the conversation permanently. Homo sapiens did not simply replace Neanderthals. In multiple documented episodes, spread across tens of thousands of years and multiple geographic regions, the 2 species had children together, and those children's descendants are still alive. If you are reading this, and your ancestry traces back to Europe, East Asia, South Asia, or the Americas, between 1 and 4% of your DNA is Neanderthal. That is not a rounding error. That is a measurable, functional inheritance. Some of the Neanderthal gene variants carried by living humans today are associated with immune system function, particularly the ability to respond to RNA viruses. There is a working hypothesis, still being studied, that the immune legacy of our Neanderthal ancestors has shaped how modern human populations respond to certain infectious diseases. The people we dismissed as primitive cave dwellers may have contributed to keeping some of their descendants alive through a pandemic they never lived to see. But the Neanderthals, as remarkable as they were, are only one chapter of this story. In 2010, the same year Paebo's team published the Neanderthal genome, a different paper appeared also in Nature, also from the Max Planck Institute, that introduced the world to a human species that nobody had known existed. Not a new fossil, not a newly discovered skeleton, a genome extracted from a single fragment of a child's finger bone found in Denisova cave in the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia. The cave sits at the meeting point of Russia, Mongolia, Kazakhstan, and China, geographically central to the largest landmass on Earth. The genome did not match Homo sapiens. It did not match Neanderthal. It was something else entirely. The researchers called them Denisovans, after the cave, and from that moment, everything we thought we understood about the human family tree acquired a new and quietly unsettling dimension. In the years since that first discovery, the total physical evidence for the Denisovans has remained almost surreally sparse, a handful of teeth. A partial jawbone found in Baixia Karst Cave in Shahe County in Gansu Province, China, deity at an altitude of 3,280 meters, identified as Denisovan not by any visual feature, but by ancient protein analysis, published by Fahu Chen and colleagues in 2019. That jaw fragment is the only Denisovan fossil found outside of Denisova cave itself, and yet the genetic evidence tells a story of a population that was widespread, successful, and deeply interwoven with the human lineage. Certain populations in Papua New Guinea, Aboriginal Australians, and peoples of island Southeast Asia carry up to 6% Denisovan DNA, a higher proportion than any living population carries of Neanderthal inheritance, suggesting a prolonged and geographically extensive period of interbreeding somewhere in Asia or the Pacific region. Tibetan peoples carry a specific gene variant called EPAS, one that allows their bodies to function efficiently at high altitudes, where oxygen levels would incapacitate or kill most humans. That gene came from the Denisovans. It passed into the Tibetan population through interbreeding, and it has been saving lives on the roof of the world ever since, in people who would have no way of knowing where that adaptation originally came from. What remains unexplained is the sheer absence of Denisovan fossils given the scale of their apparent range. One theory suggests that a significant Denisovan population lived across the lowland regions of Southeast Asia, the river valleys, coastlines, and forests of what is now Indonesia, Vietnam, the Philippines, and that when sea levels rose by approximately 120 meters at the end of the last ice age, those landscapes, and everything buried in them, went underwater. The archaeological record of the most populated Denisovan territories may simply be sitting on the ocean floor. Now move south. Move to an island called Flores in the Indonesian archipelago and enter a cave called Liang Bua. In 2003, a joint Australian-Indonesian team led by Peter Brown and Mike Morwood began recovering the remains of a human species that, when the findings were published in Nature in 2004, the scientific community greeted with something close to disbelief. Homo floresiensis stood approximately 1 meter tall. Its brain was roughly the size of a chimpanzee's. It made stone tools. It hunted pygmy elephants called stegodon. It lived on Flores until at least 50,000 years ago, overlapping with modern Homo sapiens, and possibly as recently as 12,000 years ago, which would make it a contemporary of the earliest agricultural civilizations in the Near East. The popular press immediately called it the Hobbit. The name was affectionate and a little reductive, in the way that nicknames tend to be. What Homo floresiensis actually represented was evidence that the human family had radiated into island environments, adapted to local conditions in dramatic ways, and persisted in isolated pockets of the world long after the mainstream narrative assumed only one human species remained. In 2019, that same pattern repeated itself. In Callao Cave in the Cagayan Valley of Luzon in the Philippines, a team led by Florent de Troyes of the Musée de l'Homme in Paris published findings in Nature describing yet another previously unknown human species, Homo luzonensis, identified from foot bones, hand bones, and teeth found in layers dating to at least 67,000 years ago. Homo luzonensis showed a mosaic of features, some primitive, some modern, some resembling Australopithecus fossils from Africa, that do not fit cleanly into any existing branch of the human family tree. How it got to Luzon, an island that required crossing open ocean even during periods of low sea level, remains an open and genuinely fascinating question. And then there is Homo naledi. In 2013, a recreational caver in South Africa named Stephen Tucker squeezed through a passage less than 18 centimeters wide in the Rising Star Cave System, part of the Cradle of Humankind UNESCO World Heritage Site near Johannesburg, and found himself in a chamber filled with ancient bones. When paleoanthropologist Lee Berger of the University of the Witwatersrand organized a formal excavation in 2014 and 2015, what emerged was the largest single assemblage of hominin fossils ever found in Africa. More than 1,500 individual specimens, representing at least 15 individuals, all belonging to a species that had never been described before. Homo naledi had a brain approximately one-third the size of a modern human brain. It had curved fingers suited to climbing. It had feet almost identical to ours. It was, morphologically, a creature caught between worlds, ancient features alongside surprisingly modern ones. When the dating results came back, they added another layer of complexity. Homo naledi was living between 235,000 and 335,000 years ago. That means it was alive at the same time as early Homo sapiens in Africa. Two human species, on the same continent, at the same time. But the finding that has generated the most sustained discussion among researchers is not the morphology or the dating. It is what appears to have happened inside that cave. The bones of Homo naledi were found deep within a cave system with no evidence of water transport, no predator activity, no sign that the bodies were dragged there. The deliberate placement of the dead in an inaccessible underground chamber implies intentional, repeated behavior, what many researchers carefully describe as mortuary practice. Archaeologists have noted that if this interpretation holds, it represents the oldest known evidence of deliberate body disposal in the hominin record, carried out by a species with a brain far smaller than our own, long before we assumed such behavior was possible. What that means for our understanding of consciousness, of inner life, of what it actually requires to think about death. That question does not have a clean answer yet, and that, in many ways, is the most honest thing that can be said about the family we forgot. We are only beginning to understand who they were. We spent a century dismissing them. We spent the following decades slowly, carefully, and sometimes reluctantly discovering that they were far more than we allowed ourselves to believe. They were not us, but they were not nothing. And the line between those two things turns out to be far less clear than the old story ever admitted. Somewhere out there right now, someone is listening to this in the middle of the night. Lights off, the rest of the house completely still. Someone else is hearing this on a morning commute, half a world away, watching a city move past a window. Wherever you are, whatever the clock on your wall says, drop it in the comments. Tell us where you are listening from and what time it is where you are. There is something quietly remarkable about a story this old, reaching people in so many different corners of the world, all at the same moment. We would genuinely love to know where this is finding you tonight. Picture the year 1963. A team from the University of Chicago and the Istanbul University conducts a survey of a low, unremarkable hill in southeastern Turkey. They walk the ground. They note the presence of some flint fragments. They record the site as a possible medieval cemetery, likely disturbed, probably not worth further investigation. They move on. The hill sits undisturbed for another 31 years. In 1994, a Kurdish shepherd notices something unusual protruding from the soil near the top of that same hill. Word reaches Klaus Schmidt, a German archaeologist working with the German Archaeological Institute. Schmidt visits the site, looks at what is breaking through the surface, and within minutes understands that the University of Chicago team had walked across one of the most significant archaeological sites in human history, and categorized it as a medieval cemetery. What Schmidt had found, what had been there the entire time, buried under centuries of accumulated sediment and its own deliberate backfill, was Göbekli Tepe. The name translates roughly from Turkish as Potbelly Hill. It is an almost comically modest name for what the site turned out to be. Construction at Göbekli Tepe began approximately 11,600 years ago. To put that number in some kind of human scale, when the first stones were being raised on this hill, the woolly mammoth was still alive in parts of Siberia. The wheel had not been invented. Writing would not exist for another 6,000 years. Agriculture, the development we typically use as the starting line for organized civilization, was only just beginning to emerge in the river valleys to the south, and the debate among researchers is now whether Göbekli Tepe actually predates the earliest farming in that region entirely. The structures themselves are extraordinary in a way that photographs only partially convey. The site consists of multiple circular and oval enclosures, each defined by pairs of massive T-shaped limestone pillars arranged around two even larger central pillars. The largest of those central pillars stand 5.5 meters tall and are estimated to weigh between 10 and 20 tons each. They were quarried from a limestone plateau approximately 100 meters from the site, and researchers have found an unfinished pillar still in the bedrock there, never extracted, measuring approximately 7 meters long and weighing an estimated 50 tons. The tools used to cut it were made of flint. Every visible surface of the pillars is carved. Foxes, boars, cranes, ducks, scorpions, spiders, snakes, lions, vultures rendered with an observational precision and a confident hand that suggests not a primitive attempt at decoration, but a fully developed artistic tradition. Some pillars bear abstract symbols, the H shape, the crescent, geometric forms, whose meaning has not been deciphered. And on a small number of pillars, human arms are carved in low relief along the sides, with hands meeting at the front, as though the pillar itself is a stylized human figure, standing among the animals, presiding over the space. There is no evidence of permanent habitation at Göbekli Tepe. No hearths arranged for daily domestic use, no grinding stones for processing grain in quantities consistent with a resident population. Whatever this place was, people were not living here. They were coming here, traveling to this hill, doing something that required enormous collective effort and sophisticated organizational capacity, and then leaving. The labor question alone is worth sitting with for a moment. The current estimate from researchers working at the site is that constructing a single enclosure would have required the coordinated effort of between 500 and 1,000 people over an extended period. In 11,600 BCE, feeding that many people in one location for the duration required to quarry, transport, and raise multi-ton pillars would itself have required a level of logistical planning that we previously assumed did not exist until after agriculture was firmly established. Göbekli Tepe suggests the sequence may have been reversed. Not civilization first, then monuments, but monuments first, and the organizational demands of building them, possibly driving the development of the food systems needed to support the builders. That inversion is not a fringe idea. It was Klaus Schmidt's own working hypothesis before his death in 2014, and it has been developed further by researchers including Lee Clare and Jens Nottroff of the German Archaeological Institute, who have continued the excavation in the years since. Now consider what happened to Göbekli Tepe around 8000 BCE. The site was deliberately buried, not abandoned, not left to the elements. Buried. Someone, and given the scale of the effort, many someones filled the enclosures with a dense mixture of flint flakes, animal bones, stone tools, and clean limestone rubble, packing the structures from the ground up, sealing the pillars beneath meters of intentional fill. The result was the low, rounded hill that a University of Chicago survey team would one day walk across and dismiss. The reason for the burial has never been established. One theory suggests it was a ritual act, a deliberate ending of the site's function, a closing ceremony of some kind, perhaps connected to a shift in religious practice or community structure. What remains unexplained is why the burial was so thorough, so carefully executed, and so effective. The fill that sealed Göbekli Tepe preserved it almost perfectly. The carvings are sharp, the pillars are largely intact. It is as though whoever buried it understood, on some level, that they were preserving something rather than simply ending it. As of the most recent excavation reports, only approximately 5% of the total site has been uncovered. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted by the German Archaeological Institute have revealed that the buried portions contain at least 16 additional enclosures, potentially more. What is visible today is the edge of something whose full dimensions remain. For now, this is where a separate line of research enters the picture, one that sits closer to the boundary between established science and active hypothesis. In 2017, researchers Martin Sweatman and Dimitrios Tsikritsis published a paper in the journal Mediterranean Archaeology and Archaeometry, proposing that the animal carvings on the pillars at Göbekli Tepe are not purely decorative or symbolic in a religious sense, but are instead a sophisticated record of astronomical observations, specifically a record of a catastrophic comet impact event that occurred around 10,800 BCE at the onset of a period geologists call the Younger Dryas. The Younger Dryas was a rapid and severe return to near-glacial conditions that lasted approximately 1,200 years. Temperatures in the North Atlantic region dropped by as much as 15 degrees Celsius within decades. Ecosystems collapsed. Megafauna went extinct across multiple continents. And according to Sweatman and Tsikritsis, the builders of Göbekli Tepe were recording the sky as it appeared at the moment that catastrophe began, essentially carving a date and a memorial into stone in the only language they had available to them. The hypothesis is contested. A number of archaeologists and astronomers have raised methodological objections, arguing that the pattern matching between pillar carvings and star positions relies on assumptions that cannot be independently verified. Archaeologists have noted that the site contains enough symbolic material to support multiple interpretive frameworks, which is part of what makes it so persistently compelling and so genuinely difficult to resolve. What is not contested is the date. Göbekli Tepe was built when the Younger Dryas was either ending or in its final phase. The people who raised those pillars had, in all likelihood, lived through or inherited collective memory of one of the most dramatic environmental collapses in the last 20,000 years of human history. Whether the carvings record it, mourn it, or simply coincide with its aftermath is a question the stones have not yet answered. Klaus Schmidt spent 20 years excavating this hill. He described it, in one of his final interviews before his death, not as a temple in the conventional religious sense, but as a place where something fundamental about human social organization was being worked out, where the capacity to gather, to coordinate, to build something larger than any individual need was being practiced and perhaps invented. He believed the hill still had most of its secrets. Given that 95% of it remains buried, he was almost certainly right. In the summer of 2008, a small fragment of bone was recovered from the floor of a cave in the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia. The fragment was approximately 3 centimeters long. It belonged to the fifth finger of a child, the pinky, specifically the distal phalanx, the outermost segment of the smallest finger on the hand. It was so unremarkable in appearance that the researchers who found it initially set it aside as a routine find. The kind of hominin fragment that gets catalogued, labelled, and stored while the more visually impressive material receives immediate attention. Then they extracted the DNA. What came back from the Max Planck Institute laboratory in Leipzig was not Homo sapiens. It was not Neanderthal. The mitochondrial DNA sequence was unlike anything in the existing reference database, diverging from the modern human lineage approximately 1 million years ago, substantially deeper than the Neanderthal split. The researchers, led by Johannes Kraus and Svante Pääbo, published the findings in Nature in 2010. They had a child's finger bone and a genome, and from that alone, they announced the existence of a previously unknown human species. They called them the Denisovans, after the cave where the bone was found, Denisova Cave, carved into a limestone cliff above the Anui River, in a region where the borders of Russia, Mongolia, and Kazakhstan converge. The cave had been known to local people for generations, named after a hermit called Denis, who reportedly lived there in the 18th century. It had been excavated since the 1980s by Russian archaeologist Anatoly Derevyanko of the Institute of Archaeology and Ethnography in Novosibirsk. Nobody had suspected that its occupants included an entirely undocumented branch of the human family. In the 15 years since that initial discovery, The total physical fossil evidence for the Denisovans has grown, but only barely. A handful of teeth recovered from the same cave, a fragment of skull, a jawbone found in Baishia Karst Cave, a sacred Tibetan Buddhist site in Jiahe County, Gansu Province, China, at an elevation of 3,280 meters, identified as Denisovan through ancient protein analysis and published by Fahu Chen and colleagues in Nature in 2019. That jawbone had actually been in the possession of a local monk since 1980, passed along through religious channels, its scientific significance entirely unrecognized for nearly 4 decades. So the complete physical inventory of one of the most consequential human species ever documented fits comfortably on a single laboratory workbench. And yet the genetic record tells a story of a population that was enormous, widespread, and deeply successful across a geographic range that staggers the imagination. Denisovan DNA has been detected in living human populations from Siberia to Papua New Guinea, from Aboriginal Australians to the indigenous peoples of the Philippines. The Aita Magbukon people of Luzon carry the highest confirmed proportion of Denisovan ancestry of any population, yet studied approximately 5%, published by Maximilian Lorena of Uppsala University and colleagues in 2021 in Current Biology. Populations in Papua New Guinea and Aboriginal Australians carry between 4 and 6%. They represent substantial, repeated episodes of interbreeding across a vast region over an extended period of time. One theory suggests that the Denisovans were not a single coherent population, but several distinct groups, geographically separated, adapted to radically different environments, one population in the cold highlands of Central Asia, another in the tropical lowlands of Southeast Asia, possibly others in between. The genetic diversity within what we currently call Denisovan ancestry supports this picture. When researchers compare the Denisovan DNA found in Tibetan populations with the Denisovan DNA found in Papuan populations, the two signals are sufficiently different to suggest they came from separate Denisovan groups that had been isolated from each other for a very long time. This matters because it reframes the question. We have been asking where the Denisovans lived. The better question may be where they did not live. The altitude adaptation story is perhaps the most direct evidence of what the Denisovans have given us. Most humans who live at elevations above 4,000 meters experience chronic mountain sickness. The body attempts to compensate for low oxygen by producing excess red blood cells, which thickens the blood and eventually leads to cardiovascular failure. Tibetan populations do not experience this. Their bodies regulate oxygen at high altitude through a different mechanism entirely, encoded in a gene variant called EPAS1. When researchers at the Beijing Genomics Institute first identified this variant in 2010, they noted it was unlike anything seen in lowland human populations. The subsequent ancient DNA work confirmed what the signal suggested. The EPAS1 variant in Tibetans came from the Denisovans, transferred into the ancestral Tibetan population through interbreeding, and then selected for with extraordinary speed because it was immediately, dramatically useful. Without that inherited gene, the Tibetan plateau, home to a civilization with thousands of years of continuous history, may never have been permanently settled by human beings at all. A Denisovan adaptation carried forward in living bodies, still doing its work at 3,000 meters above sea level. What remains unexplained is the near-total absence of Denisovan fossils across the enormous territory their genetics implies they occupied. One theory that has gained traction among researchers working on Southeast Asian prehistory centers on geography and sea level. At the height of the last glacial maximum, approximately 20,000 years ago, the floor of the South China Sea was largely dry land. The region called Sundaland, the exposed continental shelf connecting what is now Borneo, Java, Sumatra, and the Malay Peninsula to mainland Asia, was a landmass roughly the size of India. It would have been one of the most biologically productive environments on Earth during that period, rich in freshwater, forests, and food resources. If a major Denisovan population was concentrated in those lowland tropical zones, the physical evidence of their existence, their campsites, their tools, their bones went underwater when the ice melted and the oceans rose. It is not that the fossils were destroyed, they are likely still there, preserved in sediment on the seafloor, waiting for underwater archaeology to develop the tools and the funding to reach them. The second mystery concerns a finding that has never been fully resolved. In 2011, Pontus Skoglund and Mattias Jakobsson at Uppsala University published a paper identifying what appeared to be a genetic signal related to Denisovan ancestry in certain indigenous populations of the Amazon basin in South America. The signal was weak and the paper was careful in its conclusions, but the implication was extraordinary. Denisovan-related DNA in people whose ancestors arrived in the Americas, implying either a migration route from Southeast Asia to the Americas that bypassed the known Beringian pathway, or an earlier and completely undocumented population movement that current models of human migration do not account for. Subsequent research has neither confirmed nor dismissed the finding. It remains, as of the most recent literature, an open question with significant implications either way. Svante Pääbo, whose laboratory produced the original Denisovan genome and who received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2022, specifically for his work on ancient human genomes, has described the Denisovans as the only human group ever discovered through genetics before a fossil was found. That framing is worth dwelling on. The usual sequence, find a bone, describe a species, was entirely reversed. The genome came first, the physical being followed, fragment by fragment, years later, still incomplete. It raises a question that the available evidence does not yet answer. If we can detect a widespread, successful, biologically diverse human population from a single child's finger bone, how many other populations are out there in the genome, in the soil, in the sediment of drowned coastlines that we simply have not thought to look for yet? Archaeologists have noted, with increasing regularity over the past decade, that the hominin family tree is not a tree in any clean sense. It is something closer to a tangled network lineages diverging, reconnecting, diverging again, carrying pieces of each other forward through time in ways that defy the tidy branching diagrams that appeared in textbooks for most of the 20th century. The Denisovans are the clearest proof of that entanglement, a species with no face, no name beyond the cave where their smallest bone was found, and a genetic legacy that reaches from the roof of the world to the islands of the Pacific, living on, silently, in the people who never knew they carried them. Stand at the edge of any coastline and look out at the water. What you are looking at is not the natural boundary of the land. It is where the land used to continue stretching outward, in some places for hundreds of kilometers, across plains and river valleys and forests that are now sitting under between 60 and 120 meters of seawater. The coastline you see today is a relatively recent feature of this planet. For most of the period during which anatomically modern humans have existed, it looked fundamentally different. At the height of the last glacial maximum, approximately 20,000 years ago, so much of the Earth's water was locked into continental ice sheets that global sea levels were roughly 120 to 130 meters lower than they are today. The difference that produces is not subtle. It is continental in scale. The British Isles were not islands. A broad, low-lying landmass connected what is now eastern England to what is now the Netherlands, Denmark, and northern Germany. A territory of river systems, wetlands, forests, and coastlines that stretched across what is today the southern basin of the North Sea. Brian E. Coles, a researcher at the University of Exeter, formally named and mapped this lost landscape in 1998. She called it Doggerland, after the Dogger Bank, a shallow underwater ridge that represents its highest and therefore last submerged terrain. Doggerland did not disappear overnight. It shrank gradually over thousands of years as the ice melted, its coastlines retreating, its river valleys flooding, its human inhabitants moving with the water, until, around 6,500 years ago, it was gone entirely. Fishermen working the North Sea have been pulling up its remnants for over a century. Mammoth bones, antler tools, a barbed harpoon point, fragments of worked wood hauled up in trawling nets alongside the catch, artifacts from a landscape that ceased to exist before the Egyptian civilization began. Now move east. Move to Southeast Asia and consider what the maps looked like when Denisovans and early Homo sapiens were moving through that part of the world. The floor of the South China Sea, the Gulf of Thailand, and the Java Sea is today underwater. But during the glacial maximum, it was exposed land, a subcontinent connecting the present-day islands of Borneo, Sumatra, Java, and Bali to the mainland of Southeast Asia in a single continuous landmass. Geographers and archaeologists refer to this lost territory as Sunderland. At its maximum extent, it was approximately 2 million square kilometers, roughly the combined area of Western Europe. It sat at tropical latitudes, well-watered, biologically productive, and almost certainly among the most densely inhabited regions on Earth during the period when it existed as dry land. When the ice melted and sea levels rose, Sunderland did not flood all at once. The process took thousands of years, punctuated by episodes of more rapid inundation. The people living on those plains did not experience a single catastrophic flood. They experienced something in some ways more disorienting, a slow, generational loss of land, coastlines retreating within living memory, river mouths moving, islands forming where hilltops used to be. Whatever material culture, whatever built structures, whatever accumulated knowledge those populations carried, the physical evidence of it is now beneath water that in some areas reaches 60 meters deep. The implications for archaeology are significant and largely unaddressed. If the most productive and therefore most densely populated lowland environments of the glacial and early post-glacial world are now underwater, then the archaeological record we have been working from for the past century and a half represents a systematic bias toward upland and inland sites, the places that happen to stay dry. We have been reconstructing prehistoric humanity from the portions of the evidence that survived sea level rise, which is not the same thing as the most representative portions. This is not a speculative concern, it is a mathematical one. The continental shelves that were exposed during the glacial maximum represent approximately 27 million square kilometers of formerly habitable land now submerged. That is an area larger than the entire continent of Africa. Some of what lies on those shelves is beginning to be found. In 2001, the National Institute of Ocean Technology of India, conducting sonar surveys in the Gulf of Kambat off the coast of Gujarat, detected a series of geometric structures on the seafloor at a depth of approximately 40 meters. The structures appeared regular and rectilinear in a way that natural geological formation does not typically produce. Subsequent dredging of the area recovered worked artifacts including pottery, carved wood, and what appeared to be human remains. The site generated significant attention and significant controversy. Some researchers argued the geometric regularity was consistent with human construction. Others maintained the sonar images were being overinterpreted, and the dredged material was either intrusive or misidentified. The Indian government announced the discovery with considerable enthusiasm. The international archaeological community responded with considerably more caution. The site has never been fully excavated, and the debate over its significance has never been formally resolved. Further east, in the waters off the southern coast of Yonaguni-jima, the westernmost of Japan's Yaeyama Islands, a recreational diver named Kihachiro Aratake encountered a series of massive underwater stone terraces in 1986. The Yonaguni Monument, as it came to be known, presents a genuine interpretive puzzle. Its most prominent feature is a flat-topped rock formation approximately 25 meters below the surface, with what appear to be straight edges, right angles, and carved steps. Masaki Kimura of the University of the Ryukyus spent years diving the site and argued that the features were consistent with human construction, estimating a possible date of up to 10,000 years ago when the site would have been above water. The opposing position, advanced by geologist Robert Schoch, among others, the same Schoch who later argued for an earlier date for the Sphinx, is that the formations are natural, produced by the tendency of the local sandstone to fracture along parallel and perpendicular planes. What remains unexplained is that both interpretations have been argued by credentialed researchers in published literature, and neither has been definitively ruled out. The site remains accessible to divers today, hundredged and unstudied at the level of resolution the question requires. The broader problem is institutional and financial. Underwater archaeology is expensive in a way that land-based excavation is not. The equipment required: research vessels, remotely operated vehicles, saturation diving support, specialist conservation facilities for waterlogged material, places serious underwater survey beyond the reach of most university departments and many national heritage agencies. The result is that the submerged continental shelves despite representing the largest single category of potentially significant prehistoric site on Earth, receive a fraction of the research attention devoted to dryland archaeology. Archaeologists have noted that this is beginning to change. Slowly, LiDAR-equipped autonomous underwater vehicles, improved side-scan sonar resolution, and the development of environmental DNA sampling from seafloor sediment cores are all expanding what is technically possible. A 2019 survey of the North Sea floor by a team from the University of Bradford used sediment cores to reconstruct the ancient landscape of Doggerland in unprecedented detail, identifying former river channels, lake beds, and coastal lagoons with enough precision to suggest specific locations where concentrated archaeological deposits might be found. What that survey did not include was the funding to excavate any of those locations. One theory that has circulated among researchers working at the intersection of archaeology and climate science holds that the cultural memory of catastrophic flooding preserved in the flood narratives found in the Epic of Gilgamesh, in the Hebrew Bible, in Hindu texts, in indigenous oral traditions across multiple continents may represent something more than metaphor. The rapid inundation events that occurred at several points during the post-glacial sea level rise, particularly the episodes driven by sudden glacial lake outbursts, would have been experienced by coastal populations as genuinely catastrophic floods, walls of water, permanent loss of land, the disappearance of entire known landscapes within a human lifetime. If those events were remembered and transmitted across generations in oral tradition, they eventually found their way into written texts thousands of years later, carrying the faint outline of something that actually happened. The drowned world is not a poetic image. It is a measurable geographic reality, sitting on the seafloor, waiting. The question is not whether the evidence is there. The question is when we will decide. It is worth the effort to look. For most of the 20th century, archaeologists reconstructed the human past from what people left behind: pottery, tools, burial goods, architecture, the physical residue of lives lived in particular places, interpreted through careful excavation and comparative analysis. It was painstaking work, and it produced a broadly coherent picture of how human populations had moved, settled, and developed across the world over the past several thousand years. The picture was incomplete in places, contested in others, but it had a general shape that most researchers could agree on. Then, in the space of roughly 15 years, ancient DNA dissolved that picture and replaced it with something almost unrecognizably different. The technology that made this possible did not exist in any practical form before the late 1990s. Extracting readable genetic sequences from ancient bone requires working with material that has been degrading for centuries or millennia, contaminated by soil bacteria, fungal growth, and the DNA of every researcher who has ever handled it. The methodological breakthroughs that made ancient genomics viable developed largely through the work of Svante Pääbo at the Max Planck Institute and Eske Willerslev at the University of Copenhagen, involved not just laboratory technique, but an entirely new framework for distinguishing authentic, ancient sequences from modern contamination. Once those methods were established and refined, the field moved with extraordinary speed. What the ancient DNA revealed about European prehistory alone was enough to require the rewriting of entire textbook chapters. The story that archaeology had constructed went roughly as follows. Modern Europeans were descended primarily from two founding populations: the hunter-gatherers who had inhabited Europe since the end of the last ice age, and the farmers who migrated out of Anatolia beginning around 9,000 years ago, bringing agriculture with them and gradually replacing or absorbing the hunter-gatherer populations as they spread westward and northward across the continent. It was a relatively clean two-part origin story, supported by the archaeological evidence of the Neolithic transition and broadly accepted by the research community. The ancient DNA told a three-part story, with a third founding population that the archaeological record had entirely failed to flag. Around 5,000 years ago, roughly 3000 BCE, a population from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the vast grasslands stretching across what is now Ukraine, southern Russia, and Kazakhstan, began moving westward into Europe, with a speed and at a scale that the genetic data describes as a near replacement event. These were the Yamnaya people, a semi-nomadic, cattle-herding population whose material culture, the Kurgan burial mounds, the wheeled wagons, the distinctive ochre-stained skeletal remains, had been known to archaeology for decades. What archaeology had not established was the demographic scale of what happened when they moved west. David Reich of Harvard Medical School, whose laboratory has produced more ancient human genomes than any other institution in the world, described the findings in his 2018 book on the subject. In Britain, the genetic data showed that within a few centuries of the arrival of a population related to the Yamnaya, specifically the Belbeka people, who carried substantial steppe ancestry, the ancestry profile of the British population shifted so dramatically that the people who had built Stonehenge were almost entirely replaced, genetically, by the newcomers. A population with deep roots in the British Isles, going back thousands of years, essentially vanished from the genetic record within a time span that, in archaeological terms, is very short. The same pattern appeared across Central Europe, Scandinavia, and the Iberian Peninsula. The Neolithic farmers who had cleared the forests, built the megalithic monuments, and established the agricultural communities of prehistoric Europe were genetically displaced at a speed that implies something more than peaceful cultural exchange. One theory suggests the mechanism was plague. Researchers including Simon Rasmussen published findings in 2015 in the journal Cell, identifying ancestral strains of Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for bubonic plague in Yamnaya-era burials. The strain found in those early samples was not yet capable of flea-borne transmission, meaning it could not have caused the epidemic spread associated with medieval plague outbreaks, but it may have been transmissible through other routes, and a Neolithic European population with no prior exposure to any form of Yersinia pestis would have had no immune preparation for it whatsoever. The possibility is that steppe-associated disease preceded the steppe people themselves, moving through trade networks and collapsing Neolithic population centers before the Yamnaya-related migrations filled the demographic vacuum they left behind. This hypothesis has not been proven, but it has not been dismissed either. The genomic and archaeological evidence is consistent with it, and the research is ongoing. The Yamnaya finding was striking enough on its own, but the deeper the ancient DNA work went, the more it revealed that population replacement and near replacement events were not anomalies in European or Eurasian prehistory. They appear to have been recurring features of it. The ancient DNA work also identified a series of ancestral lineages that have no clear archaeological correlate, populations that contributed substantially to living humans, but whose physical remains have never been definitively located. One of these is the ancient North Eurasian lineage, designated ANE in the literature. This population contributed ancestry to both Native American populations and to modern Europeans, suggesting it occupied a broad territory somewhere in northern Eurasia during the glacial period. The best candidate for its physical location is somewhere in Siberia, a single individual from the Malta site near Lake Baikal, dating to approximately 24,000 years ago, and analyzed by Eske Willeslev's group in 2013, showed ANE ancestry at levels that made him more closely related to Native Americans than to East Asians living nearby today. How a Siberian population from 24,000 years ago contributed ancestry to people in Western Europe and the Americas simultaneously is a question that requires a migration history far more complex than any previously modeled. A second ghost lineage is the one researchers call Basal Eurasian. This population appears to have diverged from the main out of Africa lineage very early, before the ancestors of Europeans and East Asians separated from each other and then remained isolated from the rest of the human family for a substantial period before contributing ancestry to the populations of the ancient Near East. What is peculiar about the Basal Eurasian signal is that it shows no detectable Neanderthal admixture, whereas every other non-African human population carries some. This means the Basal Eurasians were separated from the populations that interbred with Neanderthals, sequestered somewhere, perhaps in the Arabian Peninsula or the Horn of Africa, during the period when those interbreeding events were occurring. No archaeological culture has been definitively linked to this lineage. No physical fossil has been identified as Basal Eurasian with certainty. The population exists, clearly and measurably, in the genomes of living people in the Middle East and North Africa, and nowhere else in the physical record. What remains unexplained is why findings of this magnitude population replacements at continental scale ghost lineages contributing to living populations, the near-complete genetic turnover of regions whose monuments we celebrate as foundational to our civilization have not more substantially reorganized the public understanding of human prehistory. Part of the answer is political, and it is worth naming directly. Ancient DNA findings have generated serious controversy in several national contexts, where they intersect with questions of indigenous identity, national origin, mythology, and ethnic continuity claims. The debate over Aryan origins in South Asia, where ancient DNA evidence of steppe ancestry in Bronze Age Indian populations collides with deeply held beliefs about the autochthonous origins of Vedic civilization, has produced not just academic argument but political pressure on researchers. In some European contexts, findings about the replacement of earlier populations have been selectively appropriated by groups with ethno-nationalist interests, forcing researchers to navigate the public communication of their work with unusual care. Archaeologists have noted that the resistance to ancient DNA findings is not always ideological. Some of it is disciplinary. Traditional archaeology built its interpretive frameworks over more than a century, and a technology that arrives and overturns those frameworks within 15 years generates legitimate questions about methodology, about the relationship between genetic ancestry and cultural identity, and about what it actually means to say that one population replaced another. Genes and culture do not move in lockstep. A population can be genetically replaced, while its pottery traditions, its ritual practices, and its architectural knowledge continue in the hands of the people who displaced it. The ancient DNA revolution is not finished. It has barely started. Of the potentially millions of ancient human individuals whose remains exist in museum collections, university storage facilities, and as yet unexcavated sites around the world, only a few thousand have had their genomes sequenced. Each new genome has the potential to identify a previously unknown population movement, a previously undocumented interbreeding event, or a previously invisible lineage contributing to people alive today. The picture of who we are and where we came from is being redrawn in real time by scientists working with bone fragments that have been in the ground for thousands of years, reading a record that was always there in language that we only recently learned how to understand. There is a specific kind of silence that settles over you when you stand in front of something that should not exist. Not the silence of emptiness, the silence of a question that has no clean answer, the kind that sits at the back of your mind long after you have walked away, long after you have read the explanations and considered the counterarguments and told yourself you are satisfied, the kind that stays. Certain structures produce that silence reliably, not because they are supernatural, not because they require the intervention of forces beyond human capability, but because the gap between what we know about the people who built them and what it would have taken to build them has never been fully closed. The gap is real, and the most honest thing that can be said about it is that it has not yet been explained to the standard that the evidence demands. Begin with Egypt. Not the pyramids themselves. The engineering arguments around the pyramids, while genuinely interesting, have been addressed at length elsewhere. Begin instead with something older, and with a debate that has been running in the peer-reviewed literature for more than 30 years without resolution. The Great Sphinx of Giza sits on the Giza Plateau facing east, carved from the living limestone bedrock of the site. The conventional Egyptological position dates its construction to the reign of Pharaoh Khafre, approximately 2500 BCE, based primarily on its proximity to Khafre's pyramid complex and a small diorite statue found nearby. In 1991, Robert Schoch, a geologist at Boston University, presented an analysis of the weathering patterns on the Sphinx enclosure walls, the trench carved into the bedrock, to produce the monument at the annual meeting of the Geological Society of America. His argument was straightforward and geological rather than archaeological. The erosion patterns visible on the enclosure walls are consistent with prolonged rainfall, weathering the kind produced by heavy precipitation acting on limestone over centuries. The problem is that the Giza Plateau has been hyper-arid for approximately 5,000 years. For the Sphinx enclosure to show that degree of rainfall erosion, Schoch argued, the monument, or at least its enclosure, would need to have been exposed to significant rainfall, which in that region points to a date before approximately 7000 BCE during the African humid period, when the Sahara received substantially more precipitation than it does today. The response from mainstream Egyptology was immediate, and largely dismissive. The most cited counterargument, advanced by Egyptologist Mark Lehner and others, holds that the erosion could be explained by wind, salt weathering, or periodic flooding from the Nile, and that there is no other archaeological evidence for a pre-dynastic monumental civilization capable of carving the Sphinx. Schoch has maintained his position through updated publications, most recently elaborating the hypothesis in collaboration with researcher Robert Bauval. What remains unexplained is that the geological argument has never been formally refuted on geological grounds. The counterarguments have been primarily archaeological, the absence of corroborating evidence, rather than a demonstrated alternative mechanism for the specific erosion pattern Schoch identified. The debate is ongoing between two legitimate disciplines, and it has not been resolved. Move now to the Bolivian Altiplano, at an elevation of approximately 3,800 meters above sea level, on the southern shore of Lake Titicaca. The site is called Tiwanaku. It was the center of a major Andean civilization that flourished between roughly 500 and 1000 CE, and it contains structures whose construction details have generated sustained attention from engineers and archaeologists alike. The most discussed of these is a complex called Puma Punku, a ceremonial platform whose stone blocks cut from red sandstone and hard grey andesite display characteristics that are difficult to account for using the tools and methods conventionally attributed to Tiwanaku craftspeople. The andesite blocks at Puma Punku are hard. Andesite rates between 6 and 7 on the Mohs hardness scale, which places it in the range of materials that require significant force and precision tooling to work. The blocks show flat surfaces ground to tolerances of fractions of a millimeter. They show interior corners cut at precise right angles. They show repeating H-shaped forms, drilled holes of consistent diameter, and interlocking geometries that fit together without mortar. The quarry source for the andesite has been identified approximately 10 kilometers from the site, across terrain that includes a section of Lake Titicaca itself, meaning the blocks were either transported by water on reed boats or moved overland by methods that have not been archaeologically documented. Archaeologists have noted that none of these features are technically impossible for a sophisticated pre-Columbian civilization working with stone, bone, and bronze tools, abrasive sand, and large coordinated labor forces. The argument is not impossibility. It is precision specifically. The question of how that level of dimensional consistency was achieved and maintained across large numbers of blocks, without a measurement and quality control system that leaves some kind of archaeological trace. That trace has not yet been found at Puma Punku in the form researchers would expect. Now, consider a structure on the other side of the Andes, high in the mountains above the city of Cusco in Peru. Sacsayhuaman is a ceremonial complex whose outer walls are constructed from polygonal limestone blocks fitted together without mortar in a style that appears throughout Inca architecture but reaches its most extreme expression here. The largest blocks in the outer wall weigh an estimated 128 tons. They are irregular in shape, no two blocks are identical, yet they fit against each other with gaps measured in fractions of a millimeter. The fitting is not approximate. A standard sheet of paper cannot be inserted between the blocks at most contact points. Over centuries of seismic activity in one of the world's most tectonically active regions, the wall has remained standing. Mortar-based Spanish colonial walls built next to it have not. The engineering principle at work, interlocking irregular polygonal blocks that distribute seismic energy through their contact surfaces rather than resisting it rigidly, is sophisticated. It works. It has been working for at least 500 years of documented history and probably longer. How the Inca achieved sub-millimeter fitting tolerances on 100-ton blocks of irregular limestone without metal tools beyond bronze and without optical measurement instruments, using a process that has never been fully reconstructed, remains a genuine open question in the archaeology of Andean civilization. One theory suggests the fitting was achieved through a process of iterative grinding, repeatedly lowering a block onto its neighbor, marking the high contact points with pigment or abrasion, lifting it again, grinding down the marked areas, and repeating the process until the fit was achieved. This is technically feasible for smaller blocks. For blocks weighing over 100 tons, the logistical complexity of the repeated lifting process alone represents an engineering challenge that has not been satisfactorily modeled. Shift now from stone to metal, and from the ancient world to a find that forces a different kind of question entirely. In 1901, sponge divers working off the Greek island of Antikythera in the Aegean Sea recovered fragments of a corroded bronze mechanism from a shipwreck dated to approximately 100 to 200 BCE. The fragments sat in the Athens National Archaeological Museum for decades, their significance largely unrecognized. Before historian Derek de Solla Price published the first serious analysis in 1959, subsequent decades of X-ray tomography, three-dimensional scanning, and collaborative research by the Antikythera Mechanism Research Project involving universities in Cardiff, Athens, and Thessaloniki alongside the museum have revealed a device of extraordinary complexity. The Antikythera mechanism contained at least 37 interlocking bronze gears. It modeled the movements of the sun and moon, predicted lunar and solar eclipses on an 18-year Saros cycle, tracked the 4-year cycle of the Pan-Hellenic Games, and appears to have displayed the positions of at least some of the planets. It was, by any reasonable definition, an astronomical computer, an analog calculating device of a sophistication that, according to everything else we know about ancient Greek technology, should not have existed. What makes the Antikythera mechanism genuinely puzzling is not its existence alone, but its isolation. A device of this complexity does not emerge from nothing. It implies a tradition, workshops, craftspeople, accumulated knowledge of gear cutting and precision metalwork, a client base that valued and could use such instruments. None of that supporting tradition has survived in the archaeological record. No simpler precursor devices have been found. No workshop that produced comparable work has been identified. The mechanism arrived in the historical record fully formed, from a single shipwreck, and then the tradition that produced it left no further trace. Archaeologists have noted that the absence of precursor artifacts is not conclusive evidence that precursors did not exist. Bronze corrodes, wood rots, and the material survival rate for delicate instruments from antiquity is close to zero. The tradition may have been real and simply unpreserved, but the gap between the Antikythera mechanism and everything else we have from its era remains one of the most striking discontinuities in the history of technology. These structures and objects do not require extraordinary explanations. They require better ordinary ones, more excavation, more experimental archaeology, more honest engagement with what the evidence does and does not establish. The silence they produce is not the silence of the supernatural. It is the silence of a question that the available evidence has not yet answered, asked in stone and bronze, across thousands of years, to anyone patient enough to listen. 12,900 years ago, something changed. Not gradually, not over the course of centuries in the way that climate shifts are typically described in the geological record. What the evidence shows is a transition so abrupt that it registers in ice cores, in lake sediments, in peat bogs, and in soil profiles across 4 continents as something close to instantaneous. By geological standards, a matter of decades, possibly less. Average temperatures in the North Atlantic region dropped by as much as 15 degrees Celsius. Glaciers that had been retreating for thousands of years reversed course and began advancing again. Rainfall patterns across the northern hemisphere shifted dramatically. The megafauna of North America, the woolly mammoth, the mastodon, the giant ground sloth, the American horse, the short-faced bear, the saber-toothed cat disappeared from the fossil record within a time span that, relative to the hundreds of thousands of years they had previously survived, amounts to a sudden stop. The Clovis culture, the earliest well-documented human civilization in North America, vanishes from the archaeological record at almost exactly the same moment. Geologists call this period the Younger Dryas. It lasted approximately 1,200 years, from 12,900 to 11,700 years ago, and then ended with another abrupt transition, temperatures rising back toward interglacial levels within decades. It brackets a period in human prehistory that sits just before the earliest known monumental construction at Göbekli Tepe, just before the emergence of agriculture in the Fertile Crescent, and just after whatever came before. The question of what caused the Younger Dryas has been debated for decades. The dominant explanation for much of the late 20th century involved the disruption of Atlantic Ocean circulation, specifically the hypothesis that the catastrophic draining of a massive glacial lake called Lake Agassiz into the North Atlantic flooded the ocean with cold fresh water, disrupting the thermohaline circulation system that distributes heat across the northern hemisphere. That mechanism is physically plausible, and the evidence for large glacial lake drainage events during this period is solid. But in 2007, a research team led by Richard Firestone of the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that proposed a different and considerably more dramatic cause. Examining sediment layers at 26 sites across North America, the team identified a thin, dark geological horizon consistently appearing at the precise stratigraphic level corresponding to 12,900 years ago, containing an anomalous concentration of materials that do not belong there. Platinum group elements, including iridium, at levels far above natural background concentrations. Nanodiamonds, microscopic diamond crystals, formed only under conditions of extreme pressure and heat. Magnetic spherules, tiny glass-like beads, formed when rock or soil is instantaneously melted and then rapidly cooled. Shocked quartz grains of quartz bearing the internal fracture patterns produced by hypervelocity impact, and a layer of charcoal and soot consistent with continent-wide wildfires of a scale that dwarfs anything in the Holocene record. The team's proposed explanation was a fragmented comet or asteroid impacting the Laurentide ice sheet, the massive ice mass covering most of North America at the time, triggering the fires, the dust loading of the atmosphere, and ultimately the disruption of ocean circulation that produced the Younger Dryas cooling. They called it the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. The response from the scientific community was divided, and it has remained divided ever since, in a debate that is genuinely unresolved and genuinely important. Subsequent research expanded the evidence base substantially. By 2018, James Kennett of the University of California, Santa Barbara and colleagues had published findings in the Journal of Geology documenting the Younger Dryas boundary layer, the YDB layer, as researchers refer to it, at 52 sites across 4 continents, including locations in Western Europe, the Middle East, and South America. The presence of the same anomalous materials at the same stratigraphic horizon across sites separated by thousands of kilometers is difficult to explain through purely terrestrial processes. The geographic distribution of the evidence, the proponents argue, is consistent with an airbursting or fragmenting impactor that distributed material across a wide portion of the northern hemisphere. The counterarguments have focused primarily on methodology. A 2014 paper by Annelies van Hoesel and colleagues, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, disputed the nanodiamond identification in several European YDB sites, arguing that the crystals identified by Firestone's team were not cubic nanodiamonds, a genuine impact marker, but graphene and other carbon forms that can be produced by non-impact processes. YDIH proponents responded that the counter-researchers had used different analytical methods and had examined different samples, and that the identification of impact markers requires specific techniques that were not consistently applied in the replication attempts. The methodological dispute is technical, specific, and unresolved at the level of the primary literature. What is not disputed is the abruptness of the Younger Dryas onset, the mass extinction of North American megafauna, or the disappearance of the Clovis culture at this horizon. What is disputed is whether an extraterrestrial impact was the cause, or whether the convergence of evidence reflects something else. Coincidence of timing, methodological inconsistency, or a terrestrial mechanism not yet fully modelled. Now consider a site called Abu Huraira. Abu Huraira was a settlement in what is now the Euphrates Valley of northern Syria, one of the earliest known sites of permanent human habitation, occupied continuously from approximately 13,000 BCE through to roughly 6,000 BCE, bridging the transition from hunter-gatherer to agricultural lifestyles in real time. It was excavated by Andrew Moore of Oxford University in 1972 and 1973, shortly before the construction of the Tabqa Dam flooded the site beneath what is now Lake Assad. The excavation recovered an extraordinary archive of material spanning thousands of years of human habitation, and that material has been in analysis ever since. In 2012, a research team including James Kennett, Andrew Moore, and colleagues published findings examining the Abu Huraira material for evidence of the Younger Dryas boundary event. What they found was remarkable. Within the sediment layers corresponding to 12,900 years ago, the Abu Huraira samples contained melt glass, silica-rich glass, formed at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Celsius, consistent with an airburst or impact event. They contained platinum group element concentrations. They contained burned and melted bone, and structural evidence consistent with an intense, localized, instantaneous heat event, not the gradual accumulation of a hearth fire, but something sudden. The people living at Abu Huraira, the analysis suggested, had experienced the Younger Dryas boundary event directly. They had been present at a site where something produced temperatures hot enough to melt the surface, fuse the soil into glass, and burn bone instantaneously. Some of them may have survived it. The settlement shows evidence of continued occupation after the event, though the population appears to have declined significantly. Abu Huraira is now under water. The physical site cannot be re-excavated. The material recovered in 1972 and 73 is what exists, and what it contains is being worked through, slowly and carefully, by researchers who understand that they cannot go back for more. The implications of the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis for questions about lost or forgotten civilizations are significant, and they are worth stating plainly. If a major impact event occurred 12,900 years ago affecting primarily the northern hemisphere, triggering continent-wide fires, producing a sudden climate shift that lasted 12 centuries, then any organized human society that existed in the northern hemisphere before that date would have faced an extinction-level disruption. Not necessarily the extinction of every individual, but the destruction of infrastructure, the collapse of food systems, the forced migration of surviving populations, and the loss of accumulated knowledge that exists nowhere except in the minds of the people who carry it. One theory suggests that the oral traditions of catastrophic flooding, fire from the sky, and the sudden end of a previous golden age found in cultures from Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica to South Asia preserve, in mythologized form, the cultural memory of exactly this event, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Vedic accounts of a previous age destroyed by cosmic fire, the Mesoamerican traditions of previous suns, previous worlds, ended by catastrophe. One theory suggests these are not independent inventions of the human narrative imagination, but convergent memories of a real event, transmitted across 12,000 years of oral tradition before being written down. Archaeologists have noted that this interpretation requires treating mythology as a form of historical record, which is methodologically fraught but not without precedent. The work of researcher Duane Hamaker and Indigenous Australian collaborators has demonstrated that certain oral traditions in Australia accurately preserve descriptions of specific geological and astronomical events, including sea level, changes and impact crater formations dating back thousands of years. The capacity of oral tradition to carry accurate information across very long time frames should not be dismissed simply because it is unfamiliar to academic historical practice. What remains unexplained, most fundamentally, is the full picture of what the world looked like in the centuries before 12,900 years ago, and what was lost when whatever existed then was forced to begin again. Göbekli Tepe was built in the immediate aftermath of the Younger Dryas. The agriculture, the cities, the writing systems, all of it came after. What came before is written in platinum and nanodiamonds and melt glass, in a thin dark line in the soil of 4 continents, marking a moment when the world that existed before was buried and the world we know began. On the humid coastal lowlands of the Gulf of Mexico, in the states of Veracruz and Tabasco, there are faces in the stone, 17 of them, as of the most recent count, carved from basalt boulders weighing between 6 and 40 tons, quarried from the Tuxtla Mountains located between 50 and 100 kilometers from where the heads now sit. Each face is distinct individual features, individual expressions, each wearing what appears to be a fitted helmet or headdress. The largest stands nearly 3.5 meters tall. The smallest is still taller than a standing adult. They were made by the Olmec, the civilization that archaeologists identify as the foundational culture of Mesoamerica, the root from which the Maya, the Aztec, and the other great civilizations of the region grew. The Olmec flourished along the Gulf Coast of Mexico between approximately 1500 and 400 BCE. Their major centers, San Lorenzo in Veracruz, La Venta in Tabasco, Tres Zapotes, further west, were among the earliest large-scale urban settlements in the Americas. They built ceremonial platforms, developed a sophisticated calendar system, and produced a body of art whose influence echoes forward through 1,000 years of Mesoamerican civilization that followed them. The colossal heads were first brought to serious scientific attention by Matthew Stirling of the Smithsonian Institution, who led excavations at Tres Zapotes in 1939 and at La Venta and San Lorenzo in subsequent years. When Stirling's photographs and descriptions of the heads reached the wider archaeological community, they generated immediate discussion, not primarily about the engineering achievement of carving and transporting multi-ton basalt boulders across difficult terrain, though that achievement is considerable, but about the faces themselves. The facial features of the Olmec colossal heads, the broad, flat noses, the full lips, the specific geometry of the facial structure do not resemble the facial morphology most commonly associated with indigenous Mesoamerican populations. They resemble, to a degree that observers have noted consistently since Stirling's initial publications, the facial morphology of West African populations. The official position of mainstream Mesoamerican archaeology is that the features reflect natural variation within indigenous populations of the region, that the artists were depicting real individuals from their own communities, and that the perceived African resemblance is a product of observer bias applied to stylized art. This position has been maintained consistently by the major research institutions working on Olmec material. The alternative interpretation has a specific scholarly history. Ivan van Sertima, a Guyanese-American linguist and historian at Rutgers University, published a book in 1976 titled "They Came Before Columbus," in which he argued that West African seafarers, specifically members of a Mali Empire expedition, believed to have launched in 1311 CE under a ruler named Abu Bakari. The second reached the Gulf Coast of Mexico before European contact and had a measurable influence on early Mesoamerican civilization. Van Sertima marshaled a range of evidence: the facial features of the colossal heads, reports in early Spanish colonial documents of dark-skinned populations encountered in certain coastal regions, botanical evidence of African plant species in pre-Columbian contexts, and oceanographic data demonstrating that the Atlantic current system would carry a vessel from the West African coast to the Gulf of Mexico without requiring active navigation against prevailing winds and currents. Mainstream archaeology rejected the thesis comprehensively. The core objection was chronological. The colossal heads predate Van Sertima's proposed contact by nearly 3,000 years, which means even if an African expedition reached Mexico in 1311, it could not explain the heads. The broader argument that African contact shaped Olmec civilization was rejected on the grounds that no African material culture, no artifacts, no genetic signal, no biological remains has been identified in Olmec archaeological contexts. One theory suggests the colossal heads simply reflect the full range of natural human facial variation present within ancient Mesoamerican populations, and that the perceived African resemblance is a case of pattern recognition applied across cultural contexts that do not share a reference frame. Archaeologists have noted that stylized monumental portraiture across many ancient cultures produces facial features that read differently to observers from different backgrounds, and that reading ethnicity from stone sculpture is methodologically unreliable. What remains unexplained is that the facial morphology question has never been resolved through the kind of physical anthropological analysis applied to skeletal remains, because the colossal heads are portraits, not skeletons, and portrait interpretation carries an irreducible subjectivity that data cannot fully eliminate. Set the heads aside for a moment and consider a different category of evidence, one that does not depend on the interpretation of artistic style and which has generated its own substantial body of peer-reviewed research. The sweet potato is native to South America. Its domestication center is in the region of present-day Peru and Ecuador, and its genetic wild ancestors are found nowhere else. Yet, when European explorers reached Polynesia in the 16th and 17th centuries, they found sweet potatoes called kumara in many Polynesian languages, a word with clear phonetic relationship to the Quechua word kumar, already established as a significant food crop across the Pacific Islands, including Hawaii, New Zealand, and Easter Island. The plant did not cross the Pacific by itself. In 2018, Pablo Muñoz Rodriguez and colleagues at the University of Oxford published a genomic analysis in Current Biology examining sweet potato samples from across the Pacific and comparing them to South American wild relatives. The analysis confirmed that Polynesian sweet potato cultivars derive from a South American domesticated lineage, and the divergence dates placed the introduction to Polynesia at somewhere between 800 and 1,000 years ago, well before any European contact with the Pacific. The implication is straightforward. At some point, between approximately 1000 and 1200 CE, there was direct contact between a South American population and a Polynesian population. Someone, either Polynesians who reached the South American coast, or South Americans who reached Polynesia, or both, made a transoceanic crossing of the Pacific Ocean and introduced a cultivated plant from one side to the other. It is a finding published in one of the world's most rigorous peer-reviewed journals, based on genomic evidence that is not interpretively ambiguous in the way that artistic resemblance is. The sweet potato finding does not establish that a civilization existed in pre-Columbian America that had systematic oceanic contact with the Old World. What it establishes is that the model of complete pre-Columbian isolation, the idea that the Americas developed entirely independently of the rest of the world until 1492, is factually incorrect in at least this one documented instance. Once that model is acknowledged to be wrong in one instance, the question becomes not whether transoceanic contact occurred, but how often, in what directions, and with what consequences. A second line of evidence is considerably more contested and requires careful handling. In 1992, Svetlana Balabanova and colleagues at the Institute of Forensic Medicine at the University of Ulm in Germany published a paper in the journal Naturwissenschaften reporting the results of chemical analysis of hair, bone, and tissue samples from 9 Egyptian mummies dating to between 1000 BCE and 400 CE. The analysis found traces of cocaine and tobacco, both plants native to the Americas, with no known Old World wild relatives, and no documented presence in the Eastern Hemisphere before Columbus. The paper was met with immediate and sustained skepticism. The most straightforward objection was contamination, that the samples had been exposed to modern material during the centuries they spent in museum storage. Balabanova and her team had anticipated this objection and had specifically tested for and reported ruling out contamination using standard forensic methodology, but the skeptics argued the methodology was insufficient for such an extraordinary claim. Subsequent researchers have reported finding similar results in additional mummy samples. Others have found nothing. The contamination hypothesis has not been definitively ruled out, and the finding has not been independently replicated under conditions rigorous enough to satisfy the critics. Archaeologists have noted that the mummy cocaine finding, if genuine, would require a pre-Columbian trade network of a scope and complexity that no other archaeological evidence currently supports, which is a reason for serious skepticism, though not a proof of error. What the Olmec heads, the sweet potato genomics, and the mummy chemical traces share is less a unified theory of pre-Columbian contact than a pattern of evidence that keeps forcing the same question back onto the table. The model of complete hemispheric isolation, 2 separate worlds, developing independently, meeting for the first time in 1492, is a clean story. It is also, on the evidence, an oversimplification. How much of an oversimplification is the question that remains open, and it is one that the next generation of ancient DNA analysis, isotopic tracing, and underwater archaeology may eventually be in a position to answer with something approaching precision. Until then, the faces in the stone look outward across the Gulf of Mexico toward an ocean that may have carried more traffic, in more directions, over more centuries than the standard account has ever fully accounted for. Science is often described as a self-correcting system. The idea is that even when individual researchers make mistakes, hold biases, or defend incorrect positions, the broader process of peer review, replication, and open publication eventually brings the evidence into alignment with reality. The description is accurate. In the long run, what it tends to understate is what happens in the shorter run, the period between when anomalous evidence first appears and when the field has processed it sufficiently to either integrate or definitively reject it. That period can last years, sometimes decades, and during that period, the people who found the anomalous evidence and the evidence itself can face responses that range from healthy skepticism to something that looks considerably less healthy. This is not a conspiracy. It is a sociological feature of how paradigms work, described with precision and without sensationalism by philosopher of science Thomas Kuhn in his 1962 book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Kuhn's argument was that established scientific frameworks do not simply update when contradictory evidence appears. They resist, sometimes fiercely, because the people working within them have built careers, methodologies, and intellectual identities around the existing framework. The resistance is human, it is predictable, and it has left a trail of cases in the archaeological record where findings that did not fit the accepted timeline were delayed, dismissed, or actively obstructed, not through shadowy coordination, but through the ordinary mechanisms of institutional inertia. Some of those cases eventually resolved in favor of the mainstream. Some resolved against it. Some remain open. Each one is worth examining on its own terms. In the summer of 1996, 2 college students discovered a human skull eroding from a bank of the Columbia River near Kennewick, Washington state. They reported it to the local coroner, who called in forensic anthropologist James Chatters. Chatters examined the remains and noted features that he described as inconsistent with the skeletal morphology of modern Native American populations. A long, narrow skull, a projecting face, features that he and subsequent researchers associated with populations more similar to ancient South Asian or Polynesian groups than to contemporary indigenous Americans. Radiocarbon dating returned an age of approximately 9,000 years, making Kennewick Man, as the skeleton came to be known, one of the oldest and most complete human skeletons ever found in the Americas. What followed was not primarily a scientific process. The United States Army Corps of Engineers, which has jurisdiction over federal waterways, moved to transfer the remains to a coalition of Columbia River tribes under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, a law designed to return indigenous remains and artifacts to their descendant communities. The tribes claimed Kennewick Man as an ancestor and requested immediate reburial, which would have ended any further scientific study. A group of 8 physical anthropologists filed suit in federal court to prevent the transfer and preserve access to the remains for research. The legal battle lasted nearly a decade. During that time, the Army Corps covered the discovery site with 500 tons of rock and fill, an action that permanently buried any additional skeletal material or associated artifacts that might have remained at the location. The covering was described as erosion control. Critics described it as the destruction of an irreplaceable archaeological site. The court ultimately ruled in favor of the scientists. The remains were studied extensively through the early 2000s. Then, in 2015, Morten Rasmussen and colleagues at the University of Copenhagen published ancient DNA analysis of Kennewick Man in Nature, finding that his genome placed him most closely with contemporary Native American populations, specifically with the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation, one of the groups that had claimed him. The morphological features that had initially suggested non-native ancestry were reinterpreted as reflecting the range of variation within ancient Native American populations before the genetic homogenization produced by post-contact population collapse. In 2017, Kennewick Man was repatriated and reburied. The DNA finding was important, and the repatriation was legally and ethically appropriate. What the case also demonstrated, clearly and on public record, was that a federal agency had taken active steps to limit scientific access to ancient human remains and had physically altered an archaeological site in ways that permanently destroyed potential evidence. The suppression, in this case, was documented and institutional, not conspiratorial, but it was real. Move forward to 2017 and to a site in San Diego County, California. The Cerruti Mastodon site was not discovered by archaeologists. It was discovered in 1992 during routine highway construction by the San Diego Natural History Museum's Paleontology Monitoring Team, which was present on the project as required by California law. What the construction equipment exposed were the partial remains of a mastodon bones and molars, along with several large cobblestones in immediate association with the skeletal material. The bones showed spiral fractures and impact marks consistent with the kind of damage produced when large mammal bones are broken by human activity to extract marrow and produce sharp flakes for use as tools. The cobblestones showed impact patterns consistent with use as hammerstones and anvils. Stephen Holan of the Center for American Paleolithic Research and colleagues published the analysis in Nature in 2017. The radiocarbon and uranium series dating of the mastodon material returned an age of approximately 130,000 years. 130,000 years. The accepted date for the earliest human arrival in the Americas, at the time of publication, was between 15,000 and 20,000 years ago. The Ceruti mastodon finding, if the interpretation was correct, pushed that date back by more than 100,000 years to a period when Homo sapiens had not yet left Africa, and the most likely candidate for a North American human presence would have been a Denisovan or Denisovan-related population. The paper was published in Nature, not a fringe journal, not a popular magazine, but the most rigorously peer-reviewed scientific publication in the world. The editors had subjected it to extensive review before accepting it. Archaeologists have noted that publication in Nature does not guarantee a finding is correct, but it does establish that the evidence clears a threshold that most research never reaches. The response from the broader archaeological community was deeply skeptical. The core objections focused on the bone damage interpretation. Critics argued that natural geological processes, including the weight of overlying sediment and possible trampling by other animals, could produce fracture patterns similar to those attributed to human activity. A second objection noted that no human remains, no stone tools of clearly manufactured form, and no other unambiguous evidence of human presence had been found in direct association with the bones. What remains unexplained is the cobblestone association, the specific placement of large, non-local stones in direct contact with fractured bone, in a pattern replicated at documented human activity sites of much later date, is difficult to account for through purely geological processes. The counter-arguments have been detailed and serious. So has the original evidence. The paper has not been retracted. The debate has not been resolved. One theory suggests that a pre-sapiens hominin, possibly a Denisovan, or a related lineage currently unknown, reached the Americas via Beringia or coastal routes during a period of lower sea level and glacial exposure, left the Ceruti bone deposit, and then disappeared from the archaeological record without leaving the kind of abundant material trace that later Clovis-era populations left. The absence of corroborating evidence is, on this reading, a function of the site's age and the low survival rate of organic material over 130,000 years, not evidence that nothing was there. The pattern that emerges across these cases, Kennewick Man, the Ceruti mastodon, and a number of other sites, including the Topper site in South Carolina, where Albert Goodyear of the University of South Carolina has recovered possible pre-Clovis lithic material from layers dating to 50,000 years ago, is not a pattern of coordinated suppression. It is a pattern of institutional resistance to findings that challenge a timeline that the field has organized itself around for decades. Archaeologists have noted that every major revision of the accepted human arrival date in the Americas has been met with the same cycle: initial dismissal, prolonged resistance, gradual accumulation of corroborating evidence, and eventual grudging acceptance. The Clovis first model, which held that the Clovis people represented the earliest Americans, was dominant until the Monte Verde site in southern Chile, excavated by Tom Dillehay of Vanderbilt University, and dated to approximately 14,500 years ago, finally accumulated enough evidence to shift the consensus in the 1990s. That process took more than 20 years from initial discovery to mainstream acceptance. The question is not whether the timeline will be revised again. Based on the trajectory of the evidence, it almost certainly will be. The question is how long the revision will take, and what will be lost in the interim sites, destroyed by construction, remains reburied before analysis, sediment layers disturbed by the machinery of a world that does not pause for archaeology. The past is not infinitely patient. Some of what it holds is already gone. What remains is still worth the effort of looking, carefully and honestly, at everything the evidence actually says. There is a question underneath all the others in this documentary. Underneath the genetics and the geology, underneath the submerged coastlines and the anomalous engineering, underneath the contested timelines and the institutional resistance, there is a question that is harder to answer with data, and for that reason more difficult to leave alone. When did the beings walking this earth begin to experience it the way we do, not just survive in it, not just navigate it efficiently enough to reproduce and pass on genes, but look at it, wonder about it, feel the weight of loss when something beautiful disappeared, reach towards something beyond the immediate and the practical, toward meaning, toward beauty, toward the knowledge that one day they would die and the desire, despite that knowledge, to leave something behind. When did that begin? The honest answer, based on the evidence accumulated over the past 3 decades, is considerably earlier than the story we have been telling ourselves. Begin in southern France, in a limestone cliff above the Ardèche River gorge. In December of 1994, 3 speleologists, Jean-Marie Chauvet, Eliette Brunel, and Christian Hilaire followed a draft of cool air through a narrow fissure in the rock and found themselves inside a cave whose walls had not been touched by human hands for approximately 22,000 years. What those walls contained, preserved in near-perfect condition by the sealed chamber, was art of a quality that stopped the researchers in place. The Chauvet Cave, as it came to be known, contains more than 400 individual animal images. Lions, bears, rhinoceroses, mammoths, horses, aurochs, deer rendered in black charcoal and red ochre, with a confidence and observational precision that would not embarrass a skilled naturalist illustrator working today. The animals are depicted in motion. Multiple figures overlap in ways that suggest depth and movement. In one panel, a pride of lions is shown in mid-hunt, their bodies arranged in a compositional grouping that implies an understanding of perspective and visual narrative that we associate with trained artistic tradition, not with people we classify as living in the Stone Age. The uranium series dating of calcite deposits overlying the images places the oldest works in the cave at approximately 36,000 years before the present. 36,000 years ago, the artists who made these images were doing something that requires not just technical skill, but aesthetic judgment. The capacity to look at a surface, visualize what it could become, and execute a transformation that serves no immediate survival purpose beyond the making of something that deserves to exist. Now move the timeline back further, much further. On the island of Sulawesi in Indonesia, in a karst cave system in the Maros Pangkep region, a series of paintings has been known to researchers since the 1950s. For decades, they were assumed to be relatively recent, perhaps a few thousand years old. In 2014, Maxime Aubert and Adam Brum of Griffith University applied uranium series dating to the calcium carbonate deposits on the cave walls and returned dates that reoriented the entire field. A hand stencil in Liang Timpuseng Cave dated to at least 39,900 years at the time. The oldest known hand stencil in the world, a figurative painting of a babirusa, a pig deer native to Sulawesi, dated to at least 35,400 years. Then, in 2024, Brum and colleagues published new findings in Nature, reporting a figurative scene in Liang Karampuang Cave in the same Maros Pangkep system, dated using a refined uranium series methodology to at least 51,200 years ago. The scene depicts what appear to be 3 human-like figures, therianthropes, beings combining human and animal characteristics in apparent interaction with a large pig. It is, as of the time of that publication, the oldest known narrative scene in the human artistic record. A story, painted on a cave wall, more than 51,000 years ago. The location matters enormously. Sulawesi is not in Europe, where most of the famous Paleolithic cave art sites are concentrated. It is in island Southeast Asia, on the other side of the world from the Franco-Cantabrian cave art tradition that dominated scholarly attention for most of the 20th century. The Sulawesi findings shattered the assumption that figurative art originated in Europe and spread outward. The capacity for representational and narrative art was present, at minimum, across a geographic range, spanning from the western edge of Europe to the eastern islands of Southeast Asia simultaneously, 50,000 years ago, among people whose lines of cultural transmission are not clearly established. One theory suggests the capacity for symbolic and representational thought is not something that emerged in one place and spread, but something that was already present in Homo sapiens populations before they dispersed from Africa. An ancestral cognitive capacity that different populations expressed in different materials in different environments, with cave walls in limestone karst regions producing the most durable record, while equally sophisticated expression in wood, fiber, skin, and perishable materials left nothing behind. Move the timeline back further still, to a cave on the southern coast of South Africa. Blombos Cave, located on the cliffs of the Western Cape near the town of Still Bay, was excavated beginning in the 1990s by Francesco Derico of the University of Bordeaux and Chris Henshelwood, then of the South African Museum, later of the University of the Witwatersrand. In the sediment layers dating to approximately 75,000 years ago, they found pieces of ochre, iron-rich red pigment, engraved with deliberate geometric cross-hatching patterns. In 2018, Henshelwood and colleagues published findings of a drawing on a silkrate flake from the same site dating to approximately 73,000 years ago. The oldest known drawing by Homo sapiens, made with an ochre crayon on stone. The patterns at Blombos are abstract. They do not depict animals or people. They are geometric lines, crosshatches, forms that carry no obvious representational content. Which raises a question that the abstract marks cannot answer by themselves. What were they for? They could have been decorative. They could have been identifying marks, personal or group symbols. They could have been part of a communication system. They could have been made in a moment of quiet attention, by someone working through something with their hands. The way people doodle today. What they demonstrate, beyond any reasonable interpretive dispute, is that the capacity for symbolic behavior, for making marks that mean something beyond their physical substrate, was present in our species at least 73,000 years ago. That is 68,000 years before the first cities. But now consider what the evidence suggests about species other than our own. In Cueva de los Aviones, a Saya cave on the Mediterranean coast of Spain, pierced and ochre-stained marine shells have been dated to approximately 115,000 years ago, at a time when the region was occupied by Neanderthals, not Homo sapiens. João Zilhão of the University of Barcelona and colleagues published the Dating in Science Advances in 2018. The shells show evidence of having been used as personal ornaments worn on the body, not discarded as food refuse. At Krapina in Croatia, the eagle talon jewelry published by Radovcic and colleagues in 2015 placed Neanderthal personal ornamentation at 130,000 years ago. At multiple sites across Europe, Neanderthals used manganese dioxide and ochre pigments in ways consistent with body decoration or symbolic marking. And then there is the chamber in the Rising Star Cave system in South Africa, where Homo naledi, a species with a brain one-third the size of ours, living 300,000 years ago, appears to have carried its dead through narrow, difficult passages deep underground to deposit them in a specific location. Lee Berger and colleagues published an additional paper in 2023 in eLife, arguing that some of the Homo naledi remains showed evidence of deliberate placement, and that the chamber walls contained possible engravings, geometric marks that, if confirmed, would push evidence of symbolic behavior back by 250,000 years, into a species we have no reason to expect it from. What remains unexplained is what all of this means for the category we use to organize our moral universe. We define human, in practice, in ways that have historically included the capacity for symbolic thought, for ritual, for grief, for the creation of beauty. The evidence keeps moving the threshold for those capacities backward and outward into species and timeframes that our existing frameworks were not built to accommodate. Archaeologists have noted that this is not a purely academic question. How we define the boundary of what deserves moral consideration has always been political. The history of defining certain human groups as less than fully human, as closer to animals, as lacking the inner life that demands ethical regard, is one of the darker, recurring patterns in recorded history. The archaeological evidence that symbolic thought, ritual behavior, and aesthetic experience were present across multiple human species, across hundreds of thousands of years, and in beings whose brains were substantially smaller than ours, does not resolve those political questions. But it does make them harder to answer, with the easy confidence that has always accompanied the worst versions of the answers. The oldest hand stencil in Liang Timpuseng Cave is a hand pressed against stone and outlined in pigment. It is the simplest possible gesture of presence. It says, without language, without ambiguity, in a form that has lasted 40,000 years, I was here. I had a hand. I reached toward this surface, and I left something of myself on it. Every species we have discussed in this documentary had some version of that impulse. Some of them left it in stone. Most of them left it in us in the genes we carry, in the adaptations that keep us alive, in the cognitive capacities whose roots go deeper than we have been willing to look. The inner life of the ancient world was not silent. We simply forgot how to hear it. 74,000 years ago, a mountain in what is now northern Sumatra erupted, not in the way that volcanoes typically erupt, a dramatic event, locally catastrophic, geologically significant. The Toba supervolcano erupted at a scale that has no equivalent in the entire span of human existence on this planet. The eruption ejected an estimated 2,800 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere, roughly 5,000 times the volume produced by the Mount Street. Helen's eruption of 1980. The ashfall covered the Indian subcontinent in a layer estimated at up to 15 centimeters deep. Sulfur dioxide injected into the stratosphere reflected sunlight back into space and triggered a volcanic winter that, according to some climate models, lasted between 6 and 10 years, and was followed by a prolonged cooling period that may have persisted for 1,000 years afterward. Stanley Ambrose of the University of Illinois proposed in 1998 that the Toba eruption produced a genetic bottleneck in the human population, a catastrophic reduction in the number of surviving Homo sapiens to somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000 breeding individuals. The bottleneck hypothesis is supported by the relatively low genetic diversity of modern humans compared to other great apes, a pattern consistent with a severe population reduction at roughly the time of the eruption. The hypothesis has been debated, with some researchers arguing the bottleneck evidence is overstated and that human populations in Africa may have been buffered from the worst effects by geographical distance from the ashfall. The debate continues, but consider what the bottleneck hypothesis implies, even in its most conservative form. At some point in the past 100,000 years, the entire human species, every living person's entire ancestral line, may have been compressed into a population smaller than the current enrollment of a mid-sized university. Every human being alive today may be descended from a group of people who could have fit into a single valley, a single river drainage, a single stretch of African coastline, surviving the aftermath of a catastrophe whose full dimensions they had no framework to understand. We nearly did not make it. The fact that we did is not a given. It is a contingency, a thread that held when it could easily have broken. In the darkness, after a sky that had stopped letting light through. That is the context in which everything this documentary has examined needs to be understood. Not as a parade of curiosities, not as a collection of mysteries assembled for their own sake, but as the accumulated evidence of what it actually cost across 300,000 years of deep time to arrive at the moment when someone first pressed a hand against a cave wall and left a mark that lasted. The Neanderthals who buried their dead at Shanidar Cave. The unknown artists who painted lions in motion at Chauvet 36,000 years ago. The builders who raised the pillars at Göbekli Tepe in the immediate aftermath of the Younger Dryas, in a landscape still recovering from whatever the sky had done to it 12,000 years before. The Denisovan population whose altitude adaptation now lives in the bodies of Tibetan farmers who have never heard the name Denisova. The people of Sunderland whose coastlines, whose settlements, whose entire known world went slowly underwater across the generations until the land they remembered as children existed only in the language their grandchildren used to describe places that were no longer there. None of them left written records. Most of them left almost nothing that has survived. What they left, in many cases, is us in our genomes, in our cognitive architecture, in the specific forms that our capacity for symbolic thought and ritual behavior took, shaped by encounters and inheritances that predate any civilization we have a name for. The world that existed before the world we know was not a prelude. It was the real thing, 300,000 years of real human lives, real human losses, real human attempts to make meaning in a universe that offered no guarantee of survival and no explanation for why the sky sometimes turned dark and the animals disappeared and the coastlines moved. We are the inheritors of all of it. And for most of the past 200 years of modern archaeology, we have been working with a fraction of the available evidence. biased toward the sites that stayed dry, the materials that survived, the cultures that left the kind of traces that 19th and 20th century fieldwork was equipped to find. That is changing. The pace of change is accelerating in ways that would have been difficult to predict even 30 years ago. Ancient DNA analysis has moved from a laboratory curiosity capable of reading a few hundred base pairs from a single specimen to a high-throughput operation producing complete genomes from thousands of ancient individuals, revolutionizing the understanding of population movement, interbreeding, and identity across the entire span of human prehistory. The ancient DNA work of the next 30 years will produce a picture of the human past that is unrecognizable compared to what we have now. LiDAR light detection and ranging has transformed the archaeology of forested and vegetated landscapes. The 2018 survey of the Maya lowlands in northern Guatemala, conducted by a consortium of researchers using airborne LiDAR, revealed more than 60,000 previously undocumented structures across an area of approximately 2,100 square kilometers, including interconnected urban infrastructure on a scale that rewrote estimates of classic Maya population density by an order of magnitude. What LiDAR has done for jungle archaeology, improved underwater autonomous vehicle technology, is beginning to do for the continental shelves, mapping the drowned landscapes of the glacial world at resolutions that will eventually make systematic excavation of specific, high-probability sites feasible. Archaeologists have noted that the Dogger Bank in the North Sea, the submerged river systems of the Gulf of Thailand, the drowned coastlines of the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, and the continental shelf off the western coast of India represent areas where the convergence of ancient population density, long occupation history, and known post-glacial inundation makes the probability of significant archaeological material very high. The tools to find it are being built. The funding to deploy those tools at the necessary scale has not yet materialized, but the technical barriers are falling. One theory suggests that the next major civilizational discovery in human prehistory will not come from a jungle, a desert, or a mountain cave. It will come from the seafloor, from a sonar survey of a submerged river delta, or a remotely operated vehicle working along the edge of a drowned coastline, finding the accumulated debris of a community that lived there for generations before the water came. That discovery could happen within the next decade. It could happen within the next year. The ocean has been keeping those sites in cold, low-oxygen conditions that in some cases preserve organic material better than surface sites exposed to air and biological activity for thousands of years. What we are doing in this moment of accelerating capability is learning to read a text that has always been there. Not a hidden text, not a suppressed text, a text written in bone and stone and genome and sediment, in languages we spent the 20th century developing the tools to translate, in places we spent the 20th century not looking because we did not yet know how to look there. The story of humanity is not the story that begins with Sumer and Egypt and ends with us, running in a clean line through 5,000 years of recorded civilization. That story is a final chapter, a relatively brief, anomalously well-documented period at the end of a 300,000-year narrative whose earlier chapters are written in fragments, scattered across continents, some of them underwater, some of them in the soil beneath cities that were built without knowing what they were built on top of. The earlier chapters contain things that matter. The genetic legacy of extinct human species that helps living people survive disease and altitude and cold. The cognitive inheritance of beings who understood enough about beauty and loss and identity to press a hand against a cave wall and surround it with pigment. The accumulated knowledge of populations who lived successfully in environments, the exposed continental shelves, the tropical lowlands, the high-altitude plateaus for tens of thousands of years before the conditions that made those environments habitable changed forever. We lost most of that knowledge when the people who carried it died, or were absorbed, or were scattered by the same catastrophic events that erased the physical evidence of their existence. What we have recovered, through the patient and extraordinary work of the researchers referenced throughout this documentary, is a partial inventory of what was there enough to understand the scale of the loss, not enough to fully measure it. In the El Castillo cave in Cantabria in northern Spain, there is a hand stencil dated by Alistair Pike of the University of Southampton and colleagues, using uranium series dating published in Science in 2012 to at least 40,800 years ago. It is one of the oldest dated examples of Paleolithic cave art in Europe. It is a left hand, fingers slightly spread, outlined in red ochre against pale limestone. The person who made it is nameless. Their language is gone. Their community is gone. The landscape they walked through looks nothing like the landscape that surrounds the cave today. Everything about their daily life, their beliefs, their experience of the world, all of it is silent. But the hand is there, still pressed against the stone, still the exact shape of a hand that reached toward a surface 40,000 years ago, in the dark, with pigment and intention, and decided that being here was worth recording. They were not the first to reach towards something. They were not the last. And the distance between that hand and the hands reading or listening to this right now is shorter than we have been taught to believe, separated not by an unbridgeable gulf of primitive versus modern, but by the long, branching, deeply tangled, still only partially understood story of what it has always meant to be human. That story is not finished. It is not even close to being fully told. And the most extraordinary chapters may still be waiting, quiet and undisturbed, beneath the water.